thanks very much indeed. I have to say, part of me thinks that we should ban ourselves from talking about events like this for at least 2-3 years until we actually know what's happening, but that would make for a rather boring environment. So I'm going to speculate. I should say that I'm a very bad gambler. I've speculated in the past and been entirely wrong, so there's no reason to expect that I'll be right this time. But I think when we're looking at financial reform, my gamble is that this is in fact about a control agenda. At the time, there was a lot of talk about more markets, and yes, there's going to be more markets, I think. But I see this as part of a control agenda, a control agenda against the banks, the way that banks have been finding ways of expanding credit in ways that the central government doesn't want them to, and particularly a control agenda against the autonomy of local governments. So let's try and put a little bit of flesh on why I've come to that conclusion. If you read through the documents of the Third Plenum, there are things that are said explicitly about financial reform, about new private banks, about moving towards interest rate liberalisation, and the key phrase was resources being allocated according to market forces, which doesn't really sound like a control agenda. These are important, but I think if we're talking about the financial system as a whole, we need to look further than this. Other reforms that have been suggested that will have important collateral impact on the financial system. Strengthening property rights, very important, I think. This doesn't immediately sound perhaps as if it's a financial reform, but has a big impact on local government's ability to raise money through selling land use rights. Breaking down monopolies. And I wonder whether this particularly means local monopolies rather than necessarily national monopolies. Explicitly says ending local protectionism, which is, I think, one of the key targets of the reforms. Readjusting centre-local financial relations and fiscal reforms. Now, all of these could have the consequence of strengthening the hand of the central government's ability to exercise macroeconomic control. So it might sound a little bit odd, it's a strengthening a control agenda for macroeconomic control. But it's a way, I think, of allowing the central government to take a firmer control over the national economy as a whole, and perhaps pulling a bit of autonomy back from local governments. I think there are 2 short-term and 3 longer-term contexts that are drivers of this reform. The short-term, and the very short-term, is the big growth in local government debt since 2009. The loans that Chinese local governments took out via their affiliated enterprises to fund the recovery from the collapse of exports have come due for repayment. They're not being repaid. They're being rolled over. There is a large amount of debt within the local government sector. Dealable. If it's a debt crisis, it's a solvable debt crisis, but for some local governments, there is, I think, a looming debt crisis. The second short-term driver is the way that credit has expanded and the central government hasn't really been able to control the expansion of that credit over the last 2 or 3 years. Shadow banking's always been an important part of the Chinese financial system. In fact, a recent report that was talking about regulation pointed to its good features. It said it was a good way of providing money to the real economy. But what we've seen since 2008 is a massive expansion of credit, according to Patrick Chovanec, equivalent to the entire size of the American financial system. And we've also seen shadow banking moving slightly out of the shadows and becoming affiliated with the formal banking system, as many of the banks have been setting up innovative ways of getting money into the economy that bypass the government's attempt to restrict the expansion of credit. One of the consequences of this is that we've seen some quite risky projects. Just this week, there was real concern that a $3 billion trust project was going to totally fail. In the end, it stepped in and was bailed out. And according to some calculations, there have been about 20 major bailouts of these sort of shadowy banking activities over the last 2 years. But I think for the government, the key thing is control. If you try and control the expansion of credit, but people keep finding ways of getting credit into the system, then they want to do something about it. And it's interesting that when they have spoken so far about regulating the shadow banking system, it's really been this sort of quasi-official shadow banking that they've been targeting, not really the more shadowy shadow banking, which leaves some people quite exposed. So I think that is one of the longer-term contexts, the attempt to try and pull back the control over the economy that in some ways was lost by the way in which China responded to the financial crisis. By allowing banks to lend, by allowing local governments to borrow, I think there was a little bit of a loss of control over the economic system. The second longer-term context is something that I've hinted at and I think has significance for what Jane's going to talk about, and that's local government financing. One of the remarkable things that's happened in the last 4 or 5 years is the way that local governments have been using their ability to sell land use rights to raise finances. We've seen a huge amount of that. It's the single biggest source now of income that is actually controlled by local governments themselves. And according to the 2000 budget, about 80% of the income that local governments control themselves comes from selling land use rights. I mean, this seems to me to be a crazy way to be funding local governments. But the reality is that local governments have been given obligations to spend, but not given the ability to raise finances to fund this spending. And I think there's a real problem there that needs to be addressed. In this respect, for the government, a financial crisis of local governments might be a good thing, because it actually gives them an opportunity to perhaps let 1 or 2 trusts go bankrupt to re-exert control. But perhaps the most important long-term driver is what is seen as irrationalities in the banking system. Now, the Chinese banks are very good at some things. They're very good at supporting state policy, for example. They're very good at getting money into the state-owned sector. They're very good at funding preferred enterprises. They're very good at sterilizing foreign currency inflows. And they're also very good at providing protection for the economy in times of crisis, as we saw in 2008, 2009. But there's some things that the banks are very bad at. They're very bad at preventing moral hazard because everybody's banking on the state. Everybody assumes that the state will just step in if the banking system goes wrong, as it did in the 1990s. They're not very good at funding small and private sector enterprises. And they're not very good at rewarding savers because savers have had very low interest rates and at sometimes negative interest rates. So in some respects, the insecurity of the normal Chinese person has been funding the state's project or the state's preferred enterprises and industrial projects. And this seems to be at the core of what the suggestions of the Third Plenum were, to make sure that resources, including finance, it's a key resource, are more efficiently allocated by the market. If they do this, though, if they really push through with this, it'll be a fundamental change in the nature of the Chinese political economy. I actually think if they really do fundamentally change the banking system, it won't just be a huge financial reform, it'll be a massive political reform. Back to my gamble, my bet is that the commanding heights of the economy, the major state-owned enterprises, won't necessarily be subject to full competition and full market forces. My bet is that the focus and the target will be more those state-owned enterprises that are controlled at the local level that often operate effective local monopolies, where local governments fund favoured companies and protect them from competition from other parts of the country. At the last count, it's very difficult to actually get agreed figures of how many state-owned enterprises there are, but over 100,000, 117 controlled by the central government, 906 or so controlled at the provincial level. That leaves a huge amount of state-owned enterprises actually controlled at lower levels of local government. And I suggest, my guess is that this is where the target of competition, this is where the target of market allocation of resources, and this is where the focus of reform is actually going to be. In the 1990s, I was convinced there was going to be a financial crisis in China. I was wrong then, I might be wrong again, but that's my best bet at the moment.
I mean, it's actually not that hard to link in some of these foreign policy developments with a lot of the things Sean was just saying, because one of the interesting things about this plenum, as was pointed out earlier, the Third Plenum normally focuses on economic reform, but one of the most significant things to come out of this one was that it also focused on security with the establishment of a National Security Council for the first time. Well, the Chinese call it State Security Council in English, but I think we call it either. What's significant about it is it shows that on the one hand, there are all those things going on that Sean spoke about, which are economic reforms, which involve taking on some very big vested interests. And on the other hand, this is balanced by a considerable tightening up both of domestic security but also foreign policy. So this makes it especially interesting that shortly after the Third Plenum, China announced its ADIZ, Air Defense Identification Zone, which I expect people know what that is. I won't go into details here, but it's a sort of marking out a large area in the East China Sea, which includes the Senkaku Islands, of Japanese territory, and was seen very much, quite rightly, I think, as an escalation of the sort of salami slicing tactics that China has been adopting in its foreign policy in these maritime territorial disputes in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. So we see this development, which is kind of counterintuitive to a lot of people who assumed that as economic reforms progressed, then China's foreign policy would become more moderate in some ways, and it would become integrated into the global system, interdependence, and so on. Instead, what we see is this apparent paradox of economic reform speeding ahead, but a hardening of domestic security and foreign policy. But I think if we stand back a bit, it's not that surprising, and this really goes to the whole heart of reform and opening itself, going right back to the 1979 and the first Third Plenum, which started all this. More recently, I guess, the Third Plenum is in the context of the new leadership of Xi Jinping coming in and inheriting a situation that is really accelerated some of those fundamental problems in reform and opening, this sort of contradiction between market reforms and social stability and foreign policy. Certainly since the global financial crisis in 2008, we saw this sort of post-financial crisis hubris. Xi Jinping was in the leadership then, of course, in the Standing Committee of the Politburo. He wasn't the leader, but he wasn't out of it. And we saw this this increasing assertiveness in Chinese foreign policy, which has escalated ever since. So we saw a kind of acceleration of some dynamics there, and we need to ask why is this? It's puzzling a lot of people. What is pushing this assertiveness? I would suggest it's not that unusual. If we look at China as a late industrializing society and country, in international relations, we tend to think in terms of analogies, which is a bit dangerous. We look at rising powers. We look back at the cases of Germany and Japan in particular. I'm very dubious of doing that if we're looking at the system level. But if we look at the sort of disruption that occurs with late industrialization, perhaps Jane will say more about the social effects of rapid economic change, modernization, then you do tend to see historically this resort to strengthening domestic security to take on vested interests, but also accompanied by an adventurous, more assertive foreign policy. Bismarck, of course, Kaiser Wilhelm are good examples of this, even Japan in the early 20th century, where you see this tension where a society going through rapid change and possible disintegration in many ways, but reforming itself. As the leadership has to take on vested interests, it's very tempting to resort to assertive foreign policy, to play on some of the old myths, political myths, in this case, the whole issue of Japan and the century of humiliation. And I think if you look at it in that way, what's happening now makes a lot of sense with the Third Plenum, this balance between economic reform and security. So I think in many ways Xi Jinping inherited this from his predecessor, and Hu Jintao, most of us think, sort of lost a lot of control over many of the domestic actors who are pushing this more assertive foreign policy, especially the military. So one of the interesting questions about Xi Jinping and the Third Plenum is what's he going to do about this? Is he going to, with this National Security Council, is he going to reassert control over all those actors who are shaping foreign policy? And we kind of think that a lot of this assertiveness in the South China Sea, East China Sea, is driven by sort of elements of the military and so on, who Hu Jintao really lost control of. So in some ways, Xi Jinping may be trying to get a more rational foreign policy. That would be an optimistic view, if that means his intention then is to sort of move back to a more moderate policy, the kind of thing we saw with Deng Xiaoping, very cautious, conservative foreign policy. But this is why the ADIZ issue is troubling, because if that was the intention, why announce this ADIZ so soon after the Third Plenum? What is the message that is being sent here? It doesn't seem to be that part of this National Security Council's job will be to rein in this assertive foreign policy. So the messages are sort of very contradictory. And I would suggest, how much time do I have?
Maybe a minute more, 2 minutes.
Okay,
max,
yeah. It's not all bad. Xi Jinping last year was trying to push forward some more constructive issues in foreign policy, in particular this idea of a new model of a great power relationship with the United States. He had a lot of diplomatic offensive in Southeast Asia to try and calm nerves down. But at the same time, we see this constant assertiveness, salami slicing in the maritime issues, territorial disputes, and how do we make sense? How do we put these things together? I would suggest that, as I say, it's not that unusual if we think about Xi Jinping having to take on those vested interests that Sean's talking about. This will be a very difficult fight for Xi, and he needs support. And where's he going to get it? Does he need the support of the military, for example? Well, one view of Xi Jinping is that he has a military background, he has the support of the military. I don't think it's so simple. It's always an issue of bargaining in the Chinese system. If he wants the support of the military, he needs to give them something too. So in that sense, we can expect the military to continue playing a role and more, defense spending to keep rising and more assertiveness. Equally, does the leadership really want to reduce the tension? There's no signs at all of China engaging in any confidence-building measures, any sort of crisis management mechanisms that have been suggested by Japan and the US and Southeast Asia. No sign of it going to arbitration over these issues at all. What we do see is a continuation of a long-standing policy that really began around about WTO entry in 2001 of creating a crisis mentality in China, that we are about to have a war. Now, this is done through the education system, the media system, national defense mobilization laws, all these things, which deliberately create a crisis mentality. So I think this is typical of a late industrializing society, I'm afraid. So when Shinzo Abe at Davos talked about a return to 2014, I think this is worrying.
1914.
Sorry,
yeah.
1914, yeah. That's right. Increasingly you hear from both sides, in Japan and China, talk about war, which I haven't really heard before. So many people saying we're in this grey area now between war and peace. We're not quite sure of China's intentions. But my suggestion here is it's driven very much by these domestic issues of reform and opening, and this fundamental problem of maintaining domestic solidarity and legitimacy.
There were these new announcements of the one-child policy, so that now it's implemented from now. It's going to be allowed for people who, in a couple who have one of whom is an only child, to have 2 children. In the past, you had to have the previous policy, and the previous relaxation on one-child policy was that you had both parents had to be have been an only child for them to be able to have 2 children. And now it's only one parent, one of the couple, who needs to have been an only child. This was something that has been talked about. It's been discussed in background. It's been experimented with, and so it wasn't a big surprise. Similarly, the reform through Labour had been mooted at least almost a year in advance of the plenum as something that was going to happen. So an abolition of those camps, which were set up in the 1950s, in which those of you who recall the anti-rightist movements of the late 1950s, where people were imprisoned, several hundreds of thousands of people imprisoned, sometimes for 20 years, they're now being abolished. And that again wasn't a surprise, and does show a continuation really in these trends of legal institutionalization in that case. And again, a slight continuation, a slight trend for the one-child policy in liberalization over those population controls. But the liberalization of the one-child policy they're not completely giving up on on these population controls. There's still a concern about maintaining sort of and controlling the growth in the population. Apparently, it's estimated that relaxing the population controls at the moment is likely to lead to an additional something like 2 million more births per year as a result. So that's taking the number of births per year from about 7 million to about 9 million as a result. Now, so there were those kind of announcements. If you look at the decision document overall, looking through it for me, I've been researching quite a lot recently the whole Hu Jintao and Jiabao period and their social policies. And for me, what I can see in the decision is really very much a continuation of what Hu and Wen were doing. And Hu and Wen, some people have talked about them as the lost decade, and I think sort of in terms of economic policy and economic reforms, that's where people feel that they've failed to grasp certain nettles. But in social policy, actually, quite a lot was going on, and it tends not to be given quite as much prominence. Everyone focuses on the economy, obviously, on the banking system and this kind of thing. But in terms of social policy, Hu and Wen did quite a lot, and I think partly they were dealing with a lot of what they perceived a lot of political problems, a lot of simmering unrest, which they felt they had to tackle, and they kind of shifted to that. So they abolished rural taxes, which created problems for local governments by taking away some of their revenue. But so they abolished local taxes. They introduced healthcare, kind of insurance, kind of cooperative medical schemes in rural areas. They extended pensions. They introduced rural pensions latterly. And then also in urban areas, they've extended the systems of social security. And what we see in the decision document is an indication that the new leaders or the new administration is simply wanting to kind of carry on with that, extending the population coverage of these schemes, trying to integrate the rural and urban as part of this process of urbanisation, which again was well flagged and sort of planned under Hu and Wen. So I don't see a lot of change there. The same rhetoric of social fairness and equity is kind of coming through the document for me. Talking about the provision of basic services, the equalisation of basic services for people as part of this, trying to bring the rural areas up with the urban. Now, within that, there are some interesting twists, things that we didn't see in the previous administration. One of them is, as Sean's alluded to, this reform of the tax system. They're saying that to provide these basic services for all, they need to make the tax system, the balance between central and local, more rational. And there's been a perception that really what tends to happen is the central government gives orders about the extension of the social security system, and then it's left to the local governments to sort of do it, but they don't have the fiscal capacity. And then, in fact, to make it happen, what tends to happen is the central government has to kind of make specific transfers to support these policies. So it's interesting that they put this in the document, and it'll be interesting to see how they think they're going to do it, because as Sean indicated, it's very difficult to, in a very decentralised fiscal system as it is now, to redistribute, and how they're going to tackle that and take away from the richer provinces and richer local governments, richer cities, has been one of the real nubs and one of the obstacles to social reform for quite a long time. I think the other thing that is worth mentioning, because I don't think it's going to come up today, interestingly, none of us is actually being asked to talk about politics and political reform and democratisation, which is kind of what we usually get these things. It may come up, maybe everyone's given up on democratisation or something. One of the interesting things that, of course, about Xi and Li is that they've been tackling corruption. And we have seen in the last year or so, I think in the year running up to the Third Plenum, 18 provincial and ministerial level officials being punished for corruption, and 182,000 other officials across the country. And this has obviously made the headlines. We all know about this. One of the reasons that seems to be going on, this does seem to be something different from before, is it's tied in with this notion of social fairness and equity as well. So they're not just about redistributing wealth, which they do talk about in the decision, but there's also this problem of this perception of the unfairness that goes along with officials being seen to be, feathering their own nests. So I think in some there are some small interesting kind of new ideas in the decision, but ones which might be difficult to implement. And but a lot of the fundamentals, they don't seem to have a lot of new big ideas in there in terms of social policy. And my sense is that the economic is going to be more important again. Whereas under who and when, I think the social was more prominent.